Christian Blackwell didn't believe in fate. He believed in code. In numbers. In logic. In the kind of meticulous algorithms that could predict behavior, eliminate risk, and build empires. Fate, to him, was just a word weak men used to explain failure. But even Christian, in all his controlled, calculated glory, couldn't explain what drew him to the woman on the sidewalk that day, or why she would end up carrying the only thing in the world he couldn't buy, legacy. It started with a mistake. He was never supposed to be driving that morning. His driver, Michael, had called out sick for the first time in 6 years. Annoyed, Christian took the wheel himself and headed south toward Ocean Beach. He told himself he needed air, clarity, space to think. But deep down, he was running. From what, he didn't know. San Francisco was quiet that morning. The fog clung to the pavement like a secret. Christian's car rolled to a smooth stop at a light near Judah Street, where the coastline began to unfold like a forgotten painting. And there she was. Sitting cross-legged on a tattered wool blanket, charcoal pencil in hand, sketching furiously on what looked like a torn piece of cardboard. Her hair was wild and windswept, partially covering a face that didn't beg for help, it dared you to look away. Her hoodie was ripped at the sleeves. Her sneakers had no laces. But her focus? It was surgical. Christian watched her draw with the kind of intensity he reserved for code reviews and boardroom negotiations. Not because she was beautiful. But because she was invisible, and yet, not hiding. The light turned green. He didn't move. Instead, he kept watching her. And the longer he did, the more he felt something tug inside him, an old, unfamiliar sensation that had no place in his world, curiosity. He drove past. But 3 blocks later, he pulled into a parking lot, stared at his hands gripping the steering wheel, and said aloud, "What the hell is wrong with me?" He sat there for nearly 10 minutes. Then, like a man possessed, he turned the car around. She was still there. Same posture. Same ruthless concentration. As if the whole world was a nuisance, and her sketch, the only thing that mattered. He rolled down the window. "Hey," he said, sharp and cold. "Come here." She didn't move at first. Her eyes flicked up. Blue, almost too blue. Sharp. Suspicious. She scanned him, the car, the clothes. She didn't look impressed. "I'm not panhandling," she replied, tone clipped. "You're wasting your time." "I'm not offering charity." "Then what the hell do you want?" Christian hesitated. This wasn't how he envisioned this playing out. He was used to people saying yes before he finished asking. "Just get in the car," he said. "I want to talk." She laughed, a short, dry, bitter sound. "Talk? With a stranger in a luxury car who shows up out of nowhere and demands things? Do I look suicidal?" "I don't have time to explain," he snapped. "I'm not here to hurt you. But I do have a proposition. One that could change your life." She squinted at him. "People like you don't change lives. You collect them." He hated how accurate that felt. Still, she climbed in. Not because she trusted him. But because she had nowhere else to be. They drove in silence through the city. The seats in his Audi were heated. She didn't comment, but he saw her lean into them slightly, soaking in the warmth like someone who hadn't felt it in days. Maybe weeks. He parked outside a nondescript cafe in the Marina District, someplace discreet, where no one would recognize him. They sat in the corner booth, away from the windows. "What's your name?" he asked, ordering 2 coffees. She didn't answer. "I'm not playing games." "Maya," she said finally. "Maya Collins." There was a beat of silence. "Maya," he repeated. "You used to draw." "I still do," she said, defiant. "Formally trained?" She scoffed. Used to be. Academy of Art. San Francisco campus. Until loans crushed me and my mom got sick. He nodded. I googled you while we were waiting for the light, he said casually. Christian Blackwell. Tech billionaire. Former genius. Current control freak. 2 divorces. 0 children. Obsessed with legacy. Sound about right? He blinked. Maybe he'd underestimated her. I want a child, he said simply. She laughed again. Try Tinder. No. I don't want a wife. I don't want a partner. I don't want love. I want an heir. One that shares my bloodline. One I can raise. One I can control. And I want you to carry it. Maya's face didn't change for several seconds. Then, slowly, it twisted into disbelief. You're insane. I'm offering you a contract. You'll live comfortably in one of my properties. Full medical care. Nutritional support. Mental health services, if you want them. And when the baby is born. You get it. And I walk away. With $1 million. Maya stared at him like he'd just offered her the moon in exchange for her soul. That's disgusting, she said. It's honest, he replied. I'm not a machine. I don't think you are. I think you're strong. Detached. Independent. Which makes you perfect for this. She looked away, her jaw clenched. I watched you draw, he continued. You were in another world. Untouchable. You've already learned how to survive without attachment. You know nothing about me. I know enough to make this offer. And I know you need a way out. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, how do I know you won't change your mind? That you won't drag me into court later and take everything back? You'll have a contract. Ironclad. You'll have legal protection. There won't be custody battles because there won't be confusion. And the baby, she asked. Just yours. No emotional consideration for the woman who grew it. That's what you want, too, isn't it? Clean lines. No mess. She stared at her coffee, fingers trembling. I don't know what I want. Christian didn't reply. He didn't need to. The room was heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, she said, give me a day. You have 48 hours. Maya stood, her body stiff. Before she turned away, she looked at him, really looked at him. You don't seem like someone who feels much, Christian Blackwell. I don't. Then maybe that's your problem. She walked out, leaving the scent of charcoal and cold wind behind her. And for the first time in years, Christian felt something stir. Not guilt. Not desire. A crack. Just wide enough for something human to crawl through. Back in his mansion that night, he poured himself a glass of scotch he didn't drink. He stared at the empty nursery he'd never dared to furnish. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he imagined what it would sound like to hear a child cry inside these sterile, perfect walls. In a park across the city, Maya sat on a damp bench beneath a streetlight, her hands on her stomach though nothing had changed, yet. She thought of her mother's final words, don't wait for rescue. Be your own. And she wondered if selling her womb to a man with no heart made her desperate. Or brilliant. She wasn't sure. But something told her this wasn't just a deal. It was a beginning. And maybe, if she played it right, it could be her last chance to rewrite everything. The day Maya Collins arrived at Christian Blackwell's estate in Napa Valley, the world outside her window shifted from chaos to silence. The transition was so abrupt it felt surreal, as if she'd walked through a glitch in reality. One day she was tracing waves with charcoal on a crumpled cardboard slab beside Ocean Beach, and the next, she stood in front of a mansion made of glass and stone that overlooked endless rows of silver-green vineyards. The car slowed at the private gate, and for a moment, Maya considered asking the driver to turn around. But then the iron gates opened without a sound, and the mansion revealed itself, a structure so pristine and symmetrical it looked like it had never been touched by weather or time. It wasn't just wealthy. It was engineered to be untouchable. Juliet met her at the door with the same efficiency Christian had exuded in the café. She was tall, poised, with perfect posture and a voice that carried authority without effort. "Welcome to the estate," she said. "Everything has been arranged for your arrival. We'll do our best to keep you comfortable." Maya followed her through the entrance and into the main hall. The walls were white with smooth concrete finishes, interrupted only by panels of glass that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the valley beyond. Every corner gleamed. There were no signs of life, no clutter, no warmth, no family photos. Just silence, and structure. She was led upstairs to a private suite with its own balcony, a marble bathroom, and a bed so large and perfectly made she hesitated before sitting on it. Everything was soft, scented faintly with lavender and lemon. On the bedside table sat a neatly arranged stack of sketchbooks and pencils, new, untouched, waiting. Juliet's voice softened slightly as she gestured toward the art supplies. "Mr. Blackwell said you might want something familiar." Maya didn't answer. Her throat tightened. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the kind of silence that amplifies every thought you're trying not to have. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. But her hand rested protectively on her abdomen, still flat, still quiet, yet already part of a decision she could never undo. In the morning, she met Carlos, the live-in nurse assigned to monitor her health. He was kind, gentle in his questions, and never looked at her with pity. He reviewed her medical history, ran basic tests, and explained the prenatal care schedule. 3 meals a day, designed by a nutritionist. Weekly therapy sessions if she chose. Monthly checkups at the clinic in San Francisco. Juliet was always nearby, maintaining order. Christian, however, was not. Weeks passed. Maya roamed the estate like a ghost trying to memorize someone else's life. The garden was immaculate. The guest library held first editions she never touched. The kitchen staff prepared meals she often left unfinished. She began to draw again, but her sketches were different now, darker, more abstract, full of tangled lines and shapes she couldn't explain. And then, slowly, something began to shift. It started with the morning envelopes. Each day, a small envelope appeared under her door. No handwriting, no seal. Inside, a single line typed in black ink. "You can't erase a past you never chose. A cracked wall still holds up the house. Some roots grow in silence." Maya didn't need to ask who they were from. Christian was a man of systems. These weren't sentimental notes. They were observations, half-confessions, coded signals from someone who didn't know how to speak plainly. But they made her pause. Made her curious. Made her wonder why a man so closed off was trying, subtly, awkwardly, but undeniably, to reach her. She began leaving her own replies in sketch form. Small drawings tucked beneath the breakfast tray. One of a woman sitting on a window ledge watching the moon. Another of a man staring into a mirror, but the reflection was a boy. She never signed them. He never acknowledged them. But every day, the envelopes kept coming. One afternoon, Juliet informed her Christian had scheduled a meeting in the East Study. Maya hesitated. She hadn't seen him since that cafe in the city. The idea of being alone with him again made her pulse quicken, not from fear, but uncertainty. Who exactly was this man? When she entered the room, he was standing near a floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, holding a glass of something amber that he wasn't drinking. He looked tired, though his suit was perfect as always. "You're adjusting," he said, still facing the vineyard. "Am I?" she replied, crossing her arms. He turned. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then he gestured toward the chair opposite his. "I wanted to check in," he said. "I realize this arrangement is unconventional. That's one word for it." Christian didn't smile, but his expression softened. "I'm not going to pretend this is normal," he said. "I don't expect you to like me. I just want things to be clear. You have full autonomy during this process. If you're uncomfortable with anything, you tell Juliet. If you want to leave." "I don't," she cut in. He blinked. "I just don't know what to feel anymore," she added, quieter now. "I thought it would be easier if I kept it transactional. But this place, this silence, it's like I'm being forced to feel things I buried a long time ago." Christian nodded slowly, almost like he understood too well. "I designed this house to eliminate noise," he said. "Now I'm starting to realize I built a mausoleum." Maya looked at him differently then. Not as a billionaire, or a buyer of wombs. But as a man trapped by his own design. She stood. "I'm going to paint the nursery," she said. "Not because I expect to stay. But because these babies deserve color." He didn't stop her. That night, she began to transform one of the bare rooms into something else. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for supplies. She used what she had: ink, charcoal, pastels. She drew waves and roots and constellations. She painted growth. And somewhere between those strokes, Maya began to change too. She volunteered to teach a virtual art class at a local community shelter for women. Juliet arranged the logistics. Maya logged in weekly from the sunroom, showing young mothers how to sketch emotion, how to turn pain into line and shadow. Sometimes, she caught Christian standing in the hallway outside, just out of frame, listening. He never joined. But she knew he was there. One evening, she found another envelope. This time, no quote. Just a small Polaroid camera, wrapped in velvet. A note attached read, "For what can't be drawn." Maya stared at it for a long time. Later that night, she stepped onto the balcony, the camera in hand. The stars hung low and bright over the vineyard. She lifted the viewfinder, focused on her reflection in the glass, and clicked. The photo emerged slowly, its image forming like a memory rising from the dark. In it, she looked like someone new. Or maybe, finally, someone whole. It had become something of a ritual. Every Friday morning, Christian Blackwell would watch from the hallway as Maya taught her virtual art class. He never stepped into the room. He never spoke. But there was something about the way she held herself, shoulders no longer hunched from cold sidewalks, hands dancing freely with charcoal again, that kept him rooted in place. Maya never acknowledged his presence, but she knew he was there. She could feel it in the silence just beyond the door, in the way Juliet would glance toward the hall as if to say, "He's watching again." The days had softened in unexpected ways. Maya found herself growing used to the quiet hum of the estate, to the rhythm of the household staff moving gently around her, to the slow but undeniable stretching of her belly beneath the thin cotton shirts Juliet left for her each week. She still felt like a guest in someone else's life, but the line between guest and occupant was beginning to blur. Christian, for his part, had changed too. He was still meticulous, still emotionally distant, but less robotic. He began asking questions, not just about her health, but about her art, her routines, her memories. He never lingered on the answers. But he listened. And one day, he surprised her. "I'd like to come with you to your next appointment," he said, voice neutral. Maya paused mid-bite at breakfast, caught off guard by the offer. He rarely made requests. More often, he made decisions. But this was something else. "Why?" she asked, studying him. "Because I want to understand what this really is." She didn't ask him to explain further. Some things didn't need language. They drove into San Francisco together 2 days later, the city skyline rising into view as fog peeled back like theater curtains. The clinic was tucked between two office towers, quiet, modern, efficient. The kind of place that didn't ask questions when rich men walked in with women they didn't sleep with. The nurse guided Maya onto the table and applied the gel to her stomach with gloved hands. Christian stood beside her, arms crossed, unreadable. "All right," the technician said cheerfully. "Let's take a look." The screen lit up, glowing in the dim room. Maya's eyes followed the cursor as it swept across shadows and shapes, her breath tight with anticipation. And then, a sound. Not just one. Two. Two tiny, steady, unmistakable heartbeats. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic thump-thump of life echoing through speakers. "Well, this is a bit of a surprise," the technician smiled. "You're having twins." Maya blinked, lips parting. "I'm sorry, what?" "Twins. They're positioned close together, so it wasn't clear earlier. But there they are." She turned to Christian, heart racing, unsure what she expected to find in his face. Shock. Disappointment. But what she saw startled her. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't calculating. He was simply, still. As if something inside him had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. Back in the car, neither of them spoke for several minutes. The city passed in streaks of color outside the window, but it felt far away, like another life. "Two," he said at last, softly. Maya nodded. He glanced at her briefly. "Does it scare you?" She answered without hesitation. "Yes. Me too." It was the first time he'd admitted to fear. That night, Maya stood in the nursery, staring at the mural she'd started weeks ago. What had begun as two birds rising from a broken nest now felt prophetic. She picked up a brush and began adding detail, feathers, shadows, flight lines. Her strokes were faster now, bolder. Not because she knew where it was going, but because she finally didn't care about getting it perfect. Christian watched from the doorway. "You changed the wings," he said. "They were too small before," she replied. "I didn't know they'd need room for two." He didn't step into the room. But he didn't leave either. The next day, Maya took out the Polaroid camera again. She snapped a photo of her reflection in the bathroom mirror, one hand cradling the soft swell of her belly. Later, she taped it above her dresser beside the first photo she'd taken on her first night there. The difference was startling. In the first photo, her eyes were defiant, closed off. In the second, they were open, vulnerable. Still scared. But softer. The hardness was beginning to melt. That evening, they shared dinner without speaking much. The chef had made roasted chicken with lemon and rosemary, but Maya barely touched hers. Christian noticed. "Do you feel all right?" "I'm fine. Just, full. All the time now." He hesitated, then asked something that startled her. "Have you thought about what you'll do after?" Maya blinked. "After?" "Once they're born." She felt a weight gather in her chest. She had tried not to think about it. Tried not to let her mind drift beyond the 9 months she'd signed up for. But now, with 2 heartbeats inside her and a nursery filling with life and color, the idea of simply walking away felt unbearable. "I don't know," she said finally. "I guess. I haven't figured that out yet." He didn't press. But the next morning, she woke to a note slipped beneath her door. "Whatever you choose, I'll make sure you land on your feet." She sat with the note for a long time. Her fingers trembled as she traced the edge of the paper. She didn't know whether to cry or scream or fold it into a paper crane and set it free from the balcony. Instead, she walked to the sunroom and began to draw. 2 cradles. A window open to the sky. And in the center, a woman holding a child in each arm, not as a transaction, not as a sacrifice, but as something holy. For the first time, Maya understood that this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about becoming. About daring to care even when you weren't supposed to. She didn't know how it would end. But now, she needed to see it through. It began with a crack in the calm. The morning was like any other. The vineyard outside Christian Blackwell's mansion was wrapped in mist. The kitchen hummed with quiet preparations, and Maya Collins sat curled up on the edge of the terrace, wrapped in a shawl, a sketchbook resting on her knees. She was working on a new piece, a quiet moment between a mother and her newborns, half finished, the strokes hesitant, unsure. She shifted slightly and felt it. Not a kick. Not a flutter. A sharp, sudden pull deep in her lower back, like the ground inside her had shifted. She froze. Then it came again, stronger, followed by a tightness that clenched her entire body from the inside out. Her sketchbook slid off her lap, landing on the stone floor with a thud. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled. Juliet found her moments later, pale and hunched against the terrace door, her hands clenched around the armrest of a chair. "I think," Maya gasped, "I think it's time." Within minutes, the estate became a flurry of urgent, coordinated movement. Juliet called the medical team and prepped the go-bag Christian had insisted on weeks ago. Carlos took Maya's vitals and confirmed what everyone already knew. She was in labor. And it was coming fast. Christian arrived less than 5 minutes later, his face unreadable but his eyes sharper than Maya had ever seen them. He moved with quiet purpose, brushing past the staff, straight to her. She was seated on the sofa, breathing heavily, one arm gripping the side of her belly. "Is it really happening?" he asked, voice low, steady. Maya nodded, her face damp with sweat. "I don't know if I'm ready." He knelt beside her, for once not a businessman, not a billionaire, but just a man, terrified, stunned, trying not to show it. "You don't have to be ready," he said. "We'll go together." The drive to UCSF Medical Center blurred into motion and color. The trees, the road, the gray skyline, it all faded behind the sound of Maya's labored breaths. Christian sat beside her in the back seat, one hand gripping hers without letting go. She didn't ask him to. He just did. At the hospital, the nurses were prepared, thanks to Christian's earlier arrangements. Maya was whisked into a delivery suite, her body trembling, heart pounding, the pain growing closer and more brutal with each contraction. Christian was told to wait outside, but he refused. "I'm staying," he said, his voice so firm and final that no one argued. Inside the room, time collapsed. The minutes stretched into hours, broken only by waves of pain that took Maya to the edge of herself and back. She screamed, cursed, cried. Sweat poured from her skin, her body shaking with the effort of bringing 2 lives into the world. And Christian was there through it all. He held her hand through every contraction, his own knuckles white. He whispered encouragement, even when his voice cracked. He brushed damp hair from her face, brought her water, spoke her name like a promise. "You're doing it," he said again and again. "You're not alone." Maya didn't know if she could do it. Her body felt like it was tearing open, like she was unraveling from the inside. But every time she thought she might fall apart completely, she felt his hand in hers, and she kept going. Then, suddenly, the doctor's voice broke through the haze. "I see the first one. One more push, Maya." She screamed, gave everything she had left, and then, in the deafening quiet, a cry rang out. High-pitched. Beautiful. Alive. "It's a boy," the doctor said, holding the small, squirming child up for just a moment before gently passing him to the nurse. Maya collapsed back against the pillows, sobbing, her entire body shaking. But it wasn't over. "You're doing great, Maya. One more." She didn't know how there could be more inside her. But she pushed again, felt the raw surge of life move through her, and then, another cry. A girl this time. Slightly smaller, but just as loud. Just as real. Christian stood frozen, eyes locked on the two infants as they were cleaned, wrapped, and laid in warm blankets beneath glowing lights. His hands were still clenched at his sides. But his entire body seemed to sway, as if something inside him had finally given way. Maya watched through tears, her vision blurred and broken, but her heart full in ways she couldn't describe. When the nurse finally placed the babies in her arms, one in each, she looked down at them, these tiny, perfect beings, and felt the earth shift beneath her again. Not from pain. From something so massive, so sacred, it defied language. They were warm. Breathing. Real. And they were hers. If only for a moment. Christian sat beside her, stunned silent. When he finally reached out to touch the boy's hand, he flinched, almost afraid to make contact. But the baby curled his fingers instinctively around Christian's. And something broke inside the man. He didn't say a word. But Maya watched as his eyes filled, his shoulders collapsed, and the weight of every cold, calculated choice he'd ever made crumbled in the presence of something utterly uncontrollable. Love. Not the transactional kind. Not the safe, contracted version he had once believed in. But the raw, terrifying, breathtaking kind that stole his breath and left him completely undone. Maya turned to him, her voice weak. "They're beautiful." He nodded, unable to speak. She held them longer than she was supposed to. She knew what the contract said. That her role ended here. That this was the moment she was supposed to step away and return to whatever life she could build with the money she'd earned. But how could anyone walk away from this? Later, as she rested in her hospital bed, the twins sleeping in warm bassinets beside her, she heard a soft knock on the door. Christian entered, holding a folder in his hand. She sat up slightly, her chest tightening. She knew what it was. The final paperwork. The transition. The goodbye. He stood at the foot of her bed and didn't speak for a long time. Then, slowly, he held the folder out in front of him. And tore it in half. Then again. And again. Until the contract was nothing but pieces of white confetti in his trembling hands. Maya stared, stunned. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I can't follow through," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I thought I could. I thought I wanted control. Clarity. But I don't. Not anymore. Christian, we had an agreement. I don't care. This," he gestured to the babies, "this changed everything." She didn't know whether to scream at him or kiss him. Her whole body trembled. "I don't want you to walk away," he continued. "I don't want to raise them without you. Not because I need help. But because I need you." Maya covered her mouth with both hands, overwhelmed. "You can't just say that now." "I know. What if I say no? Then I'll thank you. For everything. And I'll raise them with everything I have. But if there's even a chance you feel what I feel." She stood before he could finish, her body still sore but her heart beating louder than pain. "I've spent my whole life being left," she whispered. "Don't make me believe in something just to leave me, too." Christian stepped closer, careful, slow. "I won't," he said. "Not ever." And for the first time since the moment they met, Maya believed him. That night, as the twins slept, she and Christian sat together in the dim light of the hospital room, no longer two strangers joined by convenience. But something else. Something raw, uncertain, and utterly real. Love, born not from perfection, but from pain, from fear, from the kind of hope that dares to rise where it has no business surviving. And somewhere deep in her chest, Maya knew. This wasn't the end of the contract. It was the beginning of a family. The air at the Blackwell estate felt different after Maya and the twins came home. It wasn't the furniture or the new scent of lavender and talcum powder that now clung to the halls. It was something more elemental. Something in the walls themselves seemed to breathe easier. Christian had always thought of his mansion as a sanctuary, a fortress where nothing unexpected could touch him. Now, the floors creaked under the shuffle of tiny feet in soft socks. The once sterile hallways carried the echoes of cooing, soft cries, and Maya's low, steady humming during midnight feeds. There was mess now, bottles left on counters, unfolded blankets draped across furniture, a stuffed rabbit forgotten in the hallway, and Christian had never felt more at peace. He learned quickly that fatherhood wasn't a role one stepped into. It swallowed you whole. There were moments of utter helplessness when the babies screamed and nothing worked. Times he stood holding Ezra at 3 in the morning, walking laps around the nursery, whispering nonsense lullabies. June was quieter, but more sensitive. She would only sleep if Maya's voice was nearby. They were still so small, but their needs were relentless and loud and real. And he loved them. Not just because they were his blood, but because something had cracked open in him during those first nights at the hospital. He had spent decades believing control was safety, that planning was protection. Now, he found himself surrendering to unpredictability, to the vulnerability of love, to the dizzying responsibility of being needed in a way that couldn't be bought. Maya watched him change, day by day. The man who had once measured everything in returns and risks now paced the floor with burp cloths over his shoulder. She had thought her love for the twins would be the most difficult part of the arrangement, the inevitable source of pain. What she hadn't expected was falling in love with the man who'd once treated her like a contract. It was slow. Imperfect. Full of caution and moments of relapse, Christian sometimes still pulled back, still drifted into that distant place where he was more shield than person. But every time, he came back. Every time, he showed her he was trying. They didn't talk about the contract again. Not because it hadn't mattered, but because what was forming between them now had nothing to do with it. Maya began leaving her drawings around the house again, but these were different, softer, more vibrant. She sketched moments now, Ezra's tiny fist curled around Christian's tie. June asleep on her chest. Christian, asleep on the couch, both babies tangled in his arms like vines reclaiming a ruin. One morning, she found a package at her door. Inside was a slim leather box. And inside that, a ring. No note. No explanation. Just the quiet promise of something not asked for, not bargained, but freely given. Maya walked into the study where Christian sat with a baby monitor beside him and a coffee he hadn't touched. "This doesn't fix everything," she said softly, placing the box in front of him. He looked up, surprised, vulnerable in a way he no longer tried to hide. "I don't want it to," he replied. "I just want it to be real." "Then ask me," she whispered. "Not as part of a plan. Not because we have children. Ask me because it's what you want." Christian stood, slowly, walked around the desk, and took both her hands in his. "I want to build something with you. No contracts. No exits. Just a life. Together." Maya smiled, tears brimming. "Then yes." They married in the garden behind the estate on a sun-warmed afternoon in late spring. It wasn't lavish. It wasn't public. Just them, Juliet, Carlos, a few close friends, and the twins dressed in white cotton, held in Stephanie's arms as vows were exchanged beneath an arch of wildflowers Maya had helped design. Christian wore a gray suit that Maya had sketched him in weeks before, tailored, sharp, but softened by the pink rose pinned to his chest. Maya's dress was simple but radiant. No veil. No pretense. Just honesty. Their vows weren't written. They didn't need to be. Christian promised to be the man Maya had helped him become. Maya promised not to run when things got hard. And together, they promised to raise Ezra and June not with perfection, but with presence. Afterward, Stephanie approached them, cheeks wet with joy. "You make a beautiful family," she whispered. Maya looked at Christian, who was cradling Ezra against his chest, and felt something quiet settle inside her, a stillness she had never known. Peace. In the months that followed, their home transformed even more. Christian stepped back from daily operations at his company, delegating more to the board. He still sat in on major decisions, but he no longer obsessed over every detail. He had other priorities now, like learning how to make bottles without creating bubbles, or memorizing lullabies, or sneaking into the nursery just to watch his children breathe. Maya returned to her art with new energy. She converted one of the estate's spare wings into a studio and gallery space. But she didn't stop there. With Christian support, she launched a non-profit, the Collins Blackwell Foundation, dedicated to providing housing and creative support for women rebuilding their lives after homelessness, addiction, or abuse. She held weekly art classes for mothers in shelters, teaching them to turn trauma into color, into movement, into something that could be held and seen and healed. One afternoon, she returned from a class to find Christian outside with the twins, sitting beneath a tree with Ezra crawling over his lap and June gnawing on a plastic toy. The light filtered through the leaves in soft waves, and for a moment, Maya just stood and watched them, feeling more grounded than she'd ever thought possible. He looked up and smiled. "They said, Dada, today," he said, still amazed. Maya laughed. "They say that about everything." "Not like this," he insisted, and kissed June's forehead with a reverence that made Maya's heart ache. They sat together under the tree, the babies nestled between them, the afternoon slipping quietly into evening. There was no need to speak. Everything that needed to be said had already been lived. Later that night, Christian held Maya close while the twins slept in the next room. The air between them was full of warmth, of memory, of everything they'd survived to get here. "Do you ever think about how it started?" he asked, his voice soft. Maya nodded. "More than I want to. If I could go back, I'd do it differently." She turned to look at him. "No," she said. "We got here because of how messy it was. Because of how broken we were. If it had been perfect, I wouldn't have trusted it." He pulled her closer. "Then let's promise to stay messy." She smiled against his chest. "Deal." And that was the last deal they ever made. Because from that point forward, nothing between them was transactional. It was built with time, with effort, with grace. It was built with midnight feedings and long talks and apologies that came with actions, not just words. It was built with fear and with choosing each other anyway. Their life was not a fairy tale. It had no glass slippers, no magical transformations. But it had truth. It had laughter. It had two babies who grew up knowing what it meant to be loved fiercely and without condition. And it had two people, once strangers bound by desperation, who found in each other not salvation, but something far more real. A home. Christian Blackwell never imagined his legacy would begin with a broken contract and a woman who once had nothing but charcoal dust on her fingers. And Maya Collins never believed she would one day walk barefoot through vineyards, two babies on her hip, alongside the man who once treated her womb like a transaction. But life has a way of rewriting even the most calculated plans. Christian had built an empire on precision. His world was driven by logic, data, and control. He had learned early in life that emotions were liabilities, relationships were distractions, and vulnerability was a threat to power. He had married twice, each time with a hope that quickly withered under the weight of unmet expectations and his own inability to trust. He had everything money could buy: properties, status, influence. And yet, at 45, he was alone. Surrounded by silence. Haunted by an emptiness he couldn't define. Until one morning, his gaze met a girl drawing beside Ocean Beach. Her art wasn't refined. Her posture wasn't polished. But her presence, silent, focused, defiant, was impossible to ignore. That girl was Maya. A former art student whose dreams had eroded under the pressure of unpaid debts and a mother's slow death in a public care facility. With no home and little hope, she had carved out invisibility for herself, a fragile kind of safety where no one could expect anything from her and, therefore, no one could abandon her. When Christian offered her money to carry his child, Maya didn't say yes out of greed. She said yes because it was the first time someone offered her a way out. A cold, transactional way, but a way out nonetheless. What followed was never part of the plan. The contract was simple. The execution was anything but. At his mansion in Napa Valley, Maya entered a world she didn't understand, a world that didn't understand her. Marble floors. Heated sheets. Organic meals plated like artwork. Staff members who smiled without asking questions. And a man who watched from a distance, always calculating, always controlled. But beneath the luxury, Maya felt imprisoned. Not by Christian. By the knowledge that this baby growing inside her wasn't meant to be hers. That the bond forming with every kick, every craving, every heartbeat, was something she'd be asked to give away. She tried to keep her heart quiet. She painted. She volunteered. She taught art to women who, like her, had once been discarded. And slowly, her walls began to crumble. And so did his. Christian, who once lived with spreadsheets instead of people, found himself watching her. Not because she was beautiful, but because she was real. She didn't pretend. She didn't flatter. She simply existed in a way he never had the courage to. Then came the ultrasound. 2 heartbeats. Twins. In that sterile clinic room, with soft blue lights humming overhead, Christian's carefully designed blueprint shattered. 2 lives. 2 souls. 2 pieces of himself he hadn't expected, hadn't prepared for, and, strangely, didn't want to let go of. He began showing up. Not just physically, but emotionally. Quiet gestures. Unexpected questions. Late-night walks through the nursery as Maya painted the walls with constellations and birds. He wasn't trying to be a father. He already was, he just didn't know it yet. And Maya was falling apart in a different way. The more she tried to hold on to detachment, the more the babies taught her something else: love isn't clean. It's messy. Uncontrollable. Demanding. And worth everything. Then came the birth. Hours of pain. Sweat. Tears. Screams that filled the room and shook the air. And through it all, Christian was there. Holding her hand. Whispering her name. Witnessing the woman he'd once seen as a vessel become something sacred. Ezra arrived first. Then June. 2 tiny beings who fit in the crook of an arm and yet filled every inch of the room with light. And then came the decision. The contract, the document that had started everything, was waiting. Quiet. Inevitable. But Christian couldn't do it. He tore it apart in front of Maya, paper raining like snow across the hospital floor. Not because he regretted the deal. But because he no longer believed in it. It wasn't a transaction anymore. It was transformation. Still, Maya didn't say yes right away. She had been betrayed before. She had been left too many times by people who promised permanence and delivered abandonment. But Christian didn't beg. He didn't manipulate. He simply said the truth. I don't want to live without you. And for the first time in her life, Maya believed someone when they said they were staying. They became a family, not overnight, but over time. Nights filled with bottles and sleeplessness. Days full of laughter and first steps. Fights. Mistakes. Moments of doubt. But through it all, presence. Christian left the boardroom and entered the nursery. Maya turned her pain into a platform for other women. Together, they started a foundation, not for PR, but for purpose. Because they knew what it meant to fall, and what it meant to rise. Their love was never perfect. But it was real. And that was enough. Now, when Maya watches Christian playing with Ezra and June on the sunlit lawn, she no longer sees the man who once bought her body. She sees the man who gave her a home, who chose her over comfort, who allowed himself to become. And Christian? When he looks at Maya, he doesn't see a girl who came from the streets. He sees the woman who taught him how to feel. How to lose control. How to love. This wasn't the legacy he planned. It was better. Because it was honest. At first glance, Christian and Maya's story might seem like an unlikely fairy tale, an eccentric billionaire, a desperate artist, a contract-turned romance. But if we look closer, this isn't a story about wealth or coincidence. It's a story about what happens when we stop hiding behind the lives we planned, and begin living the lives we were meant to feel. Christian was a man who believed control would keep him safe. Maya was a woman who believed invisibility would keep her from being hurt. But when life forced them to confront vulnerability, through pregnancy, through emotion, through human connection, they discovered something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The power of surrender. Real connection doesn't happen when everything is stable. It happens in the mess. In the uncertainty. In the moments we admit we don't have it all figured out. This story teaches us that healing is never transactional. That no amount of money can replace the need to be seen, held, and loved without condition. That sometimes, the family we build is far more powerful than the family we plan. For anyone who has ever been afraid to trust again. For anyone who has ever believed they were too broken, too late, too lost. Let Christian and Maya remind you. It is never too late to begin again. But you have to be brave enough to step into the unknown. Because on the other side of fear is not just hope. It's home. We live in a world where everything is being packaged into performance, relationships, careers, identity. We curate our lives. We polish the surface. But what if true transformation only happens when we step out of what's curated and into what's real? You may not be a billionaire. You may not be homeless. But maybe you're building walls to protect yourself from being hurt. Maybe you're avoiding love because it feels dangerous. Maybe you've convinced yourself that emotional distance is safer than vulnerability. The truth? Safety isn't peace. Peace is what happens when you allow yourself to feel. To love. To forgive. To be seen. And to rebuild your life not on fear, but on faith in people, no matter how imperfect they are. That's what Christian and Maya did. And so can you. If this story moved you, support us. If you've made it this far, chances are this story stirred something inside you. Maybe you cried. Maybe you remembered something painful. Maybe you saw yourself in Maya's uncertainty or Christian's silence. We create these stories not just to entertain, but to heal. To connect. To remind each of us that behind every headline, every label, every first impression, there's a human heart waiting to be known. So if you believe in stories that speak truth. If you want more stories that go beyond surface and dive into what matters. Please subscribe to our channel. Your support is what gives us the motivation to keep writing, keep producing, and keep telling stories that touch the soul. Click that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave us a comment. Tell us what part of the story spoke to you most. And remember, the best stories are the ones that remind us who we really are, and who we're still becoming. We'll see you in the next one. Because this is just the beginning. Thank you for being here.